Welcome to In the Name of the Law with your host, Liisa Speaker from Speaker Law Firm. Joining her today is Steve Sinas from Sinas Dramis Law Firm, along with Mary Chartier and Takura Nyamfukudza from Chartier Nyamfukudza PLC. Now let's discuss some remarkable stories and real cases.
Welcome to In the Name of the Law. In today's episode, we're going to talk about parents being wrongfully accused of shaken baby syndrome, motorcycle accident FAQs, and a wrongful conviction case. Stay tuned.
In the name of family law.
It's a parent's worst nightmare that they're bringing their child to the emergency room because their child's just not acting right, and then all of a sudden, they're being accused of child abuse. Well, today I have with me attorney Lisa Kirsch Satawa from Oakland County, and she's at the law firm of Kirsch Daskas Law Group and specializes in representing parents in both criminal and child abuse proceedings, and oftentimes where shaken baby syndrome is the accusation against them. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Lisa.
So could you tell us what is shaken baby syndrome?
Well, shaken baby syndrome is a term that was created basically when there was a triad of symptoms. The medical community said the only way this could happen was if a baby was shaken, and that they would have retinal hemorrhaging, they would have subdural hematoma, which is a bleed between the skull and the outside of the head. And the third thing is rib fractures. And basically they would say that this happened when a parent took their hands around a baby, putting the pressure on the fingers and on the back or the posterior ribs, and they would squeeze while they were shaking and fracture the ribs, which at the same time, the brain would be going back and forth in the head, causing the bleed. And then from the pressure from the bleed, there would be bleeding in the eyes or retinal hemorrhages. And anytime those three things were present, and this is what really created the problem with the diagnosis, they would call it child abuse. It could not be anything else. It goes against the grain of the whole differential diagnosis that medicine is practiced on.
So I've heard the term abusive head trauma. Is that now replacing shaken baby syndrome?
Yes, abusive head trauma has replaced shaken baby syndrome as, I hate the name, to call it a name of this, but the reason is because there's a great dispute between the scientific community, the medical community, the child abuse validators, the child abuse naysayers, and into what is the mechanism that could cause this. There's in one camp, there has to have some sort of impact injury for this to occur. In the other camp, there doesn't need to be. You can generate enough force without impact to get these injuries. And so because shaken baby syndrome essentially describes the mechanism of the injury, they changed it to abusive head trauma because that is more of it's a much larger term. It encompasses many different kinds of things that could cause the injuries.
Well, let's talk about the science for a minute, because you mentioned that already. Is there some science that maybe is not matching up with it always being child abuse?
There's medical dispute and there's scientific dispute. Okay. So in the medical side first, and I apologize because I know you asked about the science, but on the medical side, what we see is, and to this day, is if someone has those three symptoms, the triad as it's called, it's like pathognomonic child abuse. We'll figure it out later. There are doctors who have examined babies, because it's usually a baby. It's been seen in kids up to 2 years old, but usually they're less than one. They're not ambulatory. They couldn't have caused it themselves. And when you see it, they kind of stop looking for any other causes because it's kind of the home run of child abuse in an emergency room. I hate to say that, and I don't mean to be critical of young residents, but they go to school, they learn what to do when there's suspicion of child abuse, and it kind of just is the like, oh my God, it's here kind of moment, and people immediately go into the different protocols for child abuse, and there's sometimes other issues.
Well, what can you tell us?
happen.
What are some other explanations that you've learned about in the cases that you've worked on?
There could be weakened bones. There could be injuries from birth. There could be different things that could happen from the pressure of coming through the birth canal. There could be pneumonia or some other disease that is attacking the various parts of the body. And there's all kinds of research on, unfortunately, babies who have died that have revealed all these other things that it could be. It's also unique in that they can't time a brain bleed. So it's almost impossible to be able to say that the brain bleed started on, 3 days ago, and the ribs were fractured 2 days ago, or it all happened on one day, or the ribs were fractured 4 weeks ago. Like, they can date the fractures by the degree of healing, but they can't, it's very hard for them to time it all together. And not all doctors even try to figure out what happened. What gets parents in the situation with Child Protective Services and a police investigation is when they don't have an explanation. These are, injuries that they didn't know were there. They just knew their baby wasn't acting normal usually. And then here they are, like, do you have an explanation? Do you have an explanation? Well, I've been working in child abuse for almost 30 years. I've raised 2 kids, and I'm not sure that I could tell you if my child's brain was bleeding.
Now, Lisa, I know you've worked on a lot of these cases, both in the child welfare and the criminal context. Can you tell us about one of the cases you worked on?
Sure. Unfortunately, this case did not have a happy ending, and the baby passed away. In this particular case, the baby was in a swing, the kind that's about 6 inches off the floor, had fallen out of the swing, was found by the dad with her head resting against the leg of the swing. A few hours later, she became unresponsive. Dad, rushed her to the emergency room. Unfortunately, when they got there, this emergency room wasn't equipped for a trauma 1 in a pediatric patient. So 10 hours in 3 emergency rooms later, she arrived at a hospital that could treat her. Unfortunately, where at the first hospital, she wasn't in critical condition, but did have a brain bleed. By the time she got to the 3rd hospital, she was brain dead. And
then what happened? Was there a child welfare case against them or a criminal case?
At first, there was a child welfare case against Dad only because he was there when she fell out of the swing. Then he was charged criminally with felony murder, with the underlying felony being child abuse. And then a year later, Mom was charged also. We hired experts all over the world to look at this case, and she had also had fractures. She had the brain bleed. She had the retinal hemorrhages, and we were able to go through the medical records with these various different types of doctors, child abuse experts, pathologists, orthopedic guys, pulmonary guys. I love learning from them. And also eye doctors, and discovered that she actually had pneumonia that had permeated her body in a way that there was no blood getting to her brain.
Wow.
And the doctors affirmatively said that the injury falling out of the swing could not have caused the injuries that she presented with. So this case was very complicated. It lasted for 3 years before my client, the felony murder charge was dismissed. We never had to try it. and the child protection action was about his other daughter, and that ended up being dismissed as well.
Wow. Good work on that.
Thank
you, Lisa.
In the Name of Family Law is brought to you by Speaker Law Firm. In the Name of Personal Injury Law.
Warm weather is here, and so is motorcycle season. Today we have Steve Sinas of the Sinas Dramis Law Firm to talk about the most frequently asked questions pertaining to motorcycle accidents. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me. Throughout our history, we've represented people injured in motorcycle accidents, so we hope that we can provide some answers to some of these questions here today.
Can a person injured in a motorcycle accident receive Michigan no-fault benefits?
So let me first start by explaining that Michigan no-fault benefits can be very important to a person who's seriously injured in a motorcycle accident. Unfortunately, oftentimes people who are injured in a motorcycle accident are severely hurt and they need a lot of medical care and rehab. And Michigan no-fault insurance benefits are there to cover people's long-term care needs. There are varying amounts of coverage that's available under the law, but when you think about no-fault, you should think about medical care. And it can also cover income loss, and they're payable regardless of fault. But here's the thing. If you're just injured in a motorcycle crash that doesn't involve a motor vehicle, and the way the law defines a motor vehicle defines it as something that's not a motorcycle, essentially, a car, a truck, anything like that is a motor vehicle. If a motorcyclist is injured in such a way that doesn't involve the active use of a motor vehicle, they cannot recover no-fault benefits. And that means they'll have to find some other source of coverage for their medical expenses. So when we handle these cases, the first place we start is, can the person pass the test for no-fault benefits? And sometimes it's obvious, or many times it's obvious, where you have somebody who's hit by a car. But I actually litigated a case involving high-beam headlights, where a motorcyclist was blinded by the headlights. And the question was whether the headlights were actively involved with the motorcyclist crashing his motorcycle. And we litigated the case for 4 years over that issue. Luckily, we were able to make a result for the client and get him the care that he needed. But there are times where that question can be litigated and extensively.
So if there's a dispute with who caused the accident or who should pay, which insurance company pays for that motorcyclist injuries when they have a lot of care that they need?
So it can be multiple insurance companies you have to look at. First of all, when you're talking about no-fault benefits, there's this rule that says that if the motor vehicle is involved in the crash, you actually turn to the policy that insured that motor vehicle. So if I was on a motorcycle and you were in your car and we came to an intersection and you hit me, I would claim my no-fault benefits from your policy, not my own.
Which is the opposite of what it normally is.
Right. You normally, a no-fault, you normally turn to your own policy, but there's a special rule for motorcyclists. So it can get complicated. If you don't have insurance, it can come back to my insurance. If I don't have insurance, you can even go to this thing called the assigned claims plan. So when you're talking about no-fault insurance benefits and motorcyclists, you really have to think it through.
And what if the motorcycle has no other vehicles involved?
If no motor vehicles involved, then the motorcyclist probably caused the crash on their own, or if it's another motorcyclist, they could maybe bring a different type of personal injury tort claim against the motorcyclist.
Or a pothole, maybe they could sue the county road commission.
Right. Okay. You can assess fault for other parties, but usually it's a motor vehicle is the only other party that really leads to a viable lawsuit. So, road defect cases are difficult.
So even if the motorcyclist has like a vehicle for which they have a no-fault insurance policy, it does not turn to their no-fault insurance policy because they happen to be on a motorcycle that did not involve another vehicle.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. So can the motorcyclist sue the at-fault driver?
Yes. Okay. Yes. And so if you have a collision between a motorcyclist and a motor vehicle, you're going to pursue the no-fault coverage, and you're going to pursue it through the at-fault driver's insurance policy. And when you recover those benefits, you aren't also addressing your pain and suffering needs, your pain and suffering, loss of quality of life damages that you may have due to the crash. Also, no-fault insurance benefits only cover up to 3 years of income loss. So if you are injured beyond 3 years and you can't go to work, you can make that excess damage claim for your income loss against the at-fault driver. So there are some important damages that consist of the pain and suffering claim and excess income loss that you can pursue against the at-fault driver.
Okay, so who pays for the physical damage and repair of a motorcycle under Michigan law?
So unfortunately, motorcyclists can be caught between a rock and a hard place here, where if they're hit by an at-fault driver, if they don't have their own insurance covering their motorcycle, there really isn't a way to recover their vehicle damage. There are certain ways you can sue at-fault drivers for vehicle damage if you're using a motor vehicle, but for motorcyclists, they need to insure their own motorcycle, or they're likely not going to have a source of recovery for their motorcycle damage.
So the message I'm getting from all of this is, if you own a car and you're driving a car, everybody needs to have no-fault insurance, because you have to protect yourself from the possibility that you're going to have an accident with a motorcycle, even if you're not at fault.
That's very true, actually, and there can be penalties if you don't have no-fault insurance. So
Right.
you have to have that. But one of the ways you insure yourself against having too much liability for injuring a motorcyclist is if there is that no-fault coverage in place to cover their medical care, they'll get it through no-fault insurance and not have to sue you for that medical care.
Okay, switching gears, are motorcyclists required to wear a helmet in Michigan?
They are not required to wear a helmet, but you have to be over the age of 21. You have to have a motorcycle endorsement for more than 2 years, and you have to carry this special form of insurance known as motorcycle no fault, which is different than auto no fault, not to make things more confusing, but that's the reality. And you have to buy $20,000 of motorcycle no fault coverage to be to make it legal for you to operate a motorcycle without a helmet.
So help break this down for us. For Michigan motorcyclists, what types of insurance coverage is either required, optional, or recommended?
You have to buy liability insurance and property damage insurance. That is to cover an event where your motorcycle somehow damages property. Say you run into a building or something like that, there's an insurance claim then against your auto insurance and your property damage. Liability is if you are using your motorcycle and you hurt someone else and they sue you. You have to have those coverages. If you don't, you can face penalties. You can also buy motorcycle no-fault insurance, which is that special form of no-fault insurance that actually does insure you if you're a motorcyclist, even if there's not a motor vehicle involved. So there's that special form of insurance you can buy. But then you also should be looking at whether or not you have underinsured motorist coverage through your own auto policy that will kick in the event you're operating your motorcycle and hit by a driver who's at fault but doesn't have enough insurance to cover your damages. So if I was on my motorcycle and you hit me and say you only had $50,000 of liability insurance and my damages were $200,000, if I had underinsured motorist coverage, I could turn to my auto insurance, assuming there's not a motorcycle exclusion, and make that claim. So if you're a motorcyclist, you really need to look into what your underinsured coverage is, and also uninsured coverage with your own auto insurance, and make sure that there's not a motorcycle exclusion that is in effect under your policy.
Okay, so at what point after a motorcycle accident would it make sense to contact an attorney such as yourself?
Well, the more severe your injuries, the more serious your legal rights are going to be, in terms of what you need going forward. And so if you're seriously hurt, you really need to think about all your legal rights. You need to make sure that they're properly pursued. You have various insurance coverages to be looking into. So if you know what you're doing, you can maybe try to go it alone. But I would recommend any friend or family member to consult an attorney, because it's just complicated for motorcyclists more than any other person under the Michigan no-fault law. I think motorcyclists have it most complicated.
Right. Thank you for explaining that to us, Steve.
Yes, thank you for having me on today.
In the Name of Personal Injury Law is brought to you by the Sinas Dramis Law Firm. Go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics and to view other In the Name of the Law episodes. In the Name of Criminal Defense.
We're here today to talk about the exoneration of Jeff Titus with criminal defense litigators Mary Chartier and Takura Nyamfukudza of Chartier Nyamfukudza. Now, the exoneration of Mr. Titus was your firm's 6th exoneration in 6 years. So congratulations to your firm and to Mr. Titus.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you.
So tell us, what was Mr. Titus convicted of?
Thank you, Lisa. So in 2002, let me make it very clear, he was not represented by us. This was someone else was doing. But following a jury trial, Mr. Titus was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as 2 counts of felony firearm, which means that he used the firearms to commit the murders instead of stabbing someone or poisoning them. And in Michigan, In Michigan, that means mandatory life without the possibility of parole. And thankfully, we don't have the death sentence. So he was able ultimately to walk out of prison. And that's why we're recording this.
Okay, so what led to those convictions?
Well, 2 hunters were killed in 1990 in Kalamazoo at the Fulton State Game area. And those men seemingly didn't know each other, but they were shot and killed, and they were very close proximity. And Mr. Titus was investigated because his property is one of numerous properties that abut the Fulton State Game area. And so they, spoke to everyone, and ultimately he found a gun in the woods, although the police were never able to link that gun necessarily to these killings. But so he was, he's someone who the police spoke to, and they spoke to numerous individuals. He was investigated in 1990, and he was cleared in 1990 because he had an alibi. He was hunting roughly over 40 minutes away on another property with another hunter. And the two people who own the property said his truck was in the driveway. He had coffee with them. So when these murders occurred, he was a fair distance away. And so he was cleared in 1990. But then in 2002, there was a cold case team that started investigating it. I think they started a little before 2002, but that's what ultimately led to the conviction.
Well, so if he was cleared in 1990, how was he convicted, 12 or more years later?
Well, that's the question, right, that everybody has. I mean, it was really very bananas because the two original detectives, they spoke to the property owners. They, really looked at that alibi as they did for everybody else. And the other thing is Mr. Titus would have absolutely no motive to kill these men. So he loved hunting. So the notion that he would be 45 minutes away hunting and then leave hunting to go back to his house to try and sneak back there is just, does not fit with who Mr. Titus is. But then he is and he is now, and he was then, a Marine veteran. He had worked in law enforcement as a Marine. He'd worked in security at the Veterans Affairs. So, he had no criminal history. The cold case team ignored the alibi. They said, oh, well, the alibi was like Swiss cheese. It had so many holes in it, but it really didn't. And the timeline, so the government's timeline changed over the years, but whatever timeline they had, it never fit with where Jeff Titus was at the time. Because when he was done hunting, he went to Burger King with his buddy. He'd also shot a deer. So, there's all of this evidence pointing away from him, but the cold case team really fixated on him. And then that's how he winds up really kind of getting in their, on their radar, and they never look elsewhere. I think really significantly look elsewhere. And then he has to say he was ineffective, I think is probably nice as a trial lawyer who didn't impeach witnesses with differing statements, didn't challenge the timeline, didn't really fight for Mr. Titus. So you have the police who just have him, there's just such confirmation bias. And then you have a trial lawyer who's not fighting for him. And that's how he gets convicted in 2002. And then again, to reiterate, as Takura said, we didn't represent him. We would have done things, just totally differently than, his trial lawyer did.
So then what led to the exoneration?
So what was really fascinating is the original detectives were never spoken to by the cold case team, and they weren't called or spoken to or called as witnesses by trial counsel. So they're the ones who investigated the alibi. They're the ones who knew the case really well.
And they were still working with the department? It's not like they were retired and moved to Europe.
No, you could easily find them. And they were just ignored. And they were the ones who had this really, real time knowledge of what was going on in 1990. And they were the ones who interviewed people and could kind of get a read on, how people were acting and everything. So they were just ignored by the cold case team, who were bragging about, they had 100% clearance rate and they were able to clear all these old crimes. Right. And so I know, it's just a fascinating case. And so what ultimately happens is the original detectives learn of Mr. Titus's convictions, And then both of the detectives are 100% convinced that he's innocent. And one of the detectives, who passed away not long ago, really was a supporter of Mr. Titus when he was in prison. And that continued on the entire time, where he would contact him, visit him. I mean, he was really convinced of his innocence. They ultimately contact David Moran at the University of Michigan Innocence Clinic and say, listen, there's an innocent man in prison. And how often do you think law enforcement contacts an innocence clinic to say, listen, the wrong man has been convicted? That started a very lengthy investigation. And then the case was submitted to the Attorney General's Conviction Integrity Unit, which is led by Robin Frankel, and Lori Montgomery worked on the case. And they really spent a lot of time investigating it. But the key piece of evidence that had been withheld from his defense lawyer was an alternate suspect. So there was a man from Ohio who was a serial killer of hunters, who was ID'd by two different people as being not just in the area, but really like feet away from where these murders occurred. So they positively ID'd him. He confessed to a cellmate that he killed two hunters at one time. And he actually, his timeline worked. He easily could have been in Kalamazoo to commit those killings, but his defense lawyer didn't know anything about it. And that was the critical piece that really enabled everyone to realize that he was the wrong person in prison.
So what are the rules that require the government to turn over evidence to the defense?
So there are multiple court rules and statutes, which I won't bother to list. But we also have a lot of case law. But a 1963 case, Brady versus Maryland from the United States Supreme Court, tells us that the government's withholding of evidence that is material to the determination of either guilt or punishment of a criminal defendant violates the defendant's constitutional right to due process.
Does there have to be bad faith on the part of the prosecutor or police?
There does not.
Okay, and what about if the police have it, but the prosecutor doesn't? Does that matter?
No.
Okay, so what was Mr. Titus's reaction to finally being exonerated after, what is this, over 10 years of being in prison?
Over 20 years.
I'm sorry, 20 years. So I can't do math.
20 years. So as you can imagine, he was thrilled. I mean, he was crying. He's not angry at anyone. He said that doesn't help him at all. So he's reconnecting with his family and his grandchildren. He is an amazing artist. He loves donuts. He's a big Sweetwater donut fan. So, I mean, he's out, he's just living his life the best that he can right now. And this is the subject, not just of a podcast, Constitutional Defenders, but there's a podcast called Undisclosed, which is about, I think it's over a dozen episodes specifically related to this case. And it's fascinating, as well as there's a documentary called Killer in Question. And I encourage everyone to check those out because it really digs into the misconduct that occurred here.
Mary and Takura, thank you so much. I can't wait to hear those podcasts.
Thank you, Lisa.
In the Name of Criminal Defense is brought to you by Chartier Nyamfukudza, PLC.
Thank you for watching In the Name of the Law. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for joining us today for In the Name of the Law. Please go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics, and please join us next week for another informative show.